Hello, everyone, and welcome to Genius Machines. I am excited to kick off our program with Dr. Kimberly Sablon, the Principal Director for Trusted AI and Autonomy at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. I am Patrick Tucker, Science and Technology Editor here at Defense One. And if you follow our programming and our coverage, or me, you know that we've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence since we stood up Defense One in 2013, and since I joined in 2014. And before that, I've covered artificial intelligence at The Futurist for going back a decade. It's certainly having a moment in the public eye. It is not the first time artificial intelligence has had a moment in the public eye. But there's a lot of questions and a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of hype and a little bit of concern, some of it more merited than others on all of those points. So Dr. Kimberly Sablon, if I may call you Kim, so glad to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here too, Patrick. Thanks for the invitation to join you.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what you do as the Principal Director for Trusted AI and Autonomy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, so in this role as the Principal Director, I work across the entire department. There's a lot of synchronizations and collaborations, not just within this, or across the services and DARPA, but working very closely with industry and academia as well. Part of the responsibility that I have is to really shape that strategic direction for AI and autonomy, because we're looking at those more integratedly. As you know, Mishu, since coming into the position, has really collapsed the two things into one. So we really think about it more integratedly, not just thinking about the software side, but really looking and thinking through the synergies between software and hardware, the entire stack. Okay. So part of shaping that strategic direction means that there has to be an understanding of what we're already doing across the commercial sector, commercial off-the-shelf technologies and capabilities that we can leverage and integrate more rapidly, bring into an experimentation space, understand where the limitations are, and rapidly deploy them to the end users. And with that understanding, shaping the strategic direction, focusing on the joint, but also the combined. Because as you know, we never fight alone. We work very closely with our coalition partners. And so for me, it's what are the challenges that we really need to tackle that's not just domain specific, but really addresses the joint and combined force. So we're successful in mission. There's a lot of work across the enterprise in AI that supports mostly business processes and other enterprise-wide processes. So I've really focused our roadmap or strategic direction on DoD-specific mission support, warfighting capabilities. And with that, we've outlined specific challenges that we want to tackle, having our FFRDCs, the UARCs, industry, the broader R&D community in tow with us to really tackle these hard problems for the departments. And more than happy to share what some of those challenges are that we've identified and the steps that we're taking to tackle those with you.
Yeah, let's get into some of those challenges. There's a sense, I think, from a lot of people in the public, they hear military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy, and there's a kind of initial reaction of concern. But I think a lot of people don't appreciate that the Defense Department has actually been working with AI in a lot of different ways for a very long time. And obviously, they don't know that the Defense Department is guided in this by a long list of ethics principles that they have published that you can read that are, to my mind, a great deal more in-depth and strenuous and challenging than anything that is related that I've seen out of Silicon Valley. So I think a lot of folks don't appreciate that. But when you talk to senior leadership and folks on Capitol Hill, they're much more enthusiastic about a rapid adoption of artificial intelligence by the Defense Department. They see it as a pretty critical thing that needs to happen yesterday. So tell us a little bit about some of those experimentation efforts and those challenges specifically that you feel like you're grappling with right now.
Yeah, so when I mentioned the challenges, and you're right about the public sector, I do understand their perspectives, I'll tell you though, because there are a lot of misconceptions there. But bringing this back to mission support and warfighting capabilities, the first word in my title is trust. So we've focused quite a bit on resiliency of our perception systems that tend to be very passive today. We're just passively collecting information. And we analyze a lot of this information in a very centralized manner. So focusing on resiliency of perception systems against the potential for coordinated multimodal adversarial attacks to ensure that we can absolutely trust sensory inputs, especially when we're operating in highly degraded, denied, or intermittent and latent environment, because that's the reality of where we're fighting, right? It's not I've designed something and it's going to work as designed, or the environment is a perfect environment. It is comms denied. It is GPS denied. And so we've put a lot of emphasis on that synchronization between tools that we can draw from enterprise to support tactical edge environments, and really thinking about that orchestration between enterprise and tactical edge environments, thinking about how we mature and accelerate the AI pipeline. A lot of emphasis, rightfully so, I think, on the robustness and resiliency of a lot of these AI models, not just thinking about it during development or just during deployment when we're talking about monitoring the performance of those models, but ensuring that we do this on a continuum across the entire system lifecycle, from development to deployment, not just based on known or highly anticipated threats and conditions, but we have to do that taking into consideration the dynamic nature of the battlefield where we're going to operate, and the fact that there's a range of threats and vulnerabilities that we have to be prepared for, and our models that are deployed have to be robust, so they operate in these different environments, and they have to be robust against adversarial manipulation and deception. Now, when we're deploying a lot of these models, I'll tell you again how we orchestrate those at an operational scale across very diverse asynchronous environment is a problem that we have to tackle, and we are. We're going to have multiple different vendors bringing their different AI capabilities to the table. And we've got to be able to take operational requirements and map it to what the mission needs, or translate that, really, create a Rosetta Stone that allows us to go from operational requirements, so to speak, to the AI capabilities that we require.
Okay. I want to go back to something you said just a moment ago, because I think that this deserves a lot of attention and really speaks to some of the challenge right now that really everyone, but certainly in a military context, people have when they talk about trusted AI. And you spoke about helping to make sure the integrity of sensor systems and perception systems remains intact. Really what we're talking about, right, is it could be a drone, it might be a machine learning program that's working off of satellite imagery, but we're talking about how well AI sees what's actually happening in the context where it has to operate. And perception could mean really picking up any sort of, it could be a visual signal, could be potentially radio or auditory or things like that, but perceiving that environment. Talk to me a little bit, if you will, about the security and the safety issue there. How do we, because this sounds like sort of really core to what you're talking about, how do we make sure as we flood environments, it could be the Taiwanese Strait, it could be the Red Sea, it could be any operational area with drones, with potentially soldier-borne sensors that are picking up things, as these programs look around them to see, what is the challenge in ensuring the integrity of their perception?
Yeah, so it comes down to how we evaluate user trusting and trustworthiness of a lot of those systems, right? We're putting in place a test bed that allows us to do warfighter in the loop, design, evaluation, and experimentation. We were just with our coalition partners participating in Project Convergence, Army's Project Convergence Capstone 4. And for the same reason, understanding that we are going to have perception systems that may be able to detect the target as we expect, but there are targets that are going to be camouflaged. So being able to combine what you're seeing with the ability to do active learning, on the fly and adapt, have AI models that can adapt to ensure integrity of the scene or the targets of interest is extremely important. So we do that in experimentation, develop the models, learn, reiterate on those, test and evaluation being an integral part of that in the toolbox. When we're not in the field testing this, like I said, we've actually taken the steps to operationalize responsible AI and to think about how we measure trust and evaluate trustworthiness of a lot of these AI-enabled or autonomous systems. So we've stood up, you may have heard about CATE. It's a pilot center for calibrated trust measurement and evaluation. And like I said, testbed, bring in the warfighter in the loop early to understand how the operators, when they trust the system, when they're not trusting the systems, because it's a symbiotic relationship, and there's roles and responsibilities between human operators and the machines, and those things are going to change over time based on missions and the importance of the mission sets in accordance with commander's intent. So again, in accordance with our AI ethical principles or responsible AI strategy and implementation plan guidelines that we've put in place, we've certainly adopted that mindset of experimentation and iteration across the department to ensure robustness, to ensure that we have, again, the ability to do that type of active learning, to ensure resiliency in a lot of the systems. And when we talk about resiliency, there's a security aspect of that as well. As you rightfully highlighted, that certainly comes into play there for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it to me really emphasizes the distinction between the way the U.S. military is thinking about and building and developing AI for deployment versus the way other competing nations are, and that's bringing in the warfighter, the operator at a very early stage to actually develop a relationship with, it could be an autonomous system on the ground, it could be an AI assistant tool, but it sounds like you're sort of starting from the presumption that as gifted as some of these algorithms are at taking data and reaching an output, they're going to make a lot of mistakes, and it is the operator's job to help the system actually learn from that, and then the operator at very least will have a comfort level in the thing that they have trained, and vice versa. So the system will improve, but the operator will also know strengths and weaknesses, just like training anything at all. So right now, what we know from polling is that a lot of operators have, understandably, because we have an incredibly well developed and trained non-commissioned officer corps, and they have a certain amount of skepticism towards AI systems right now, at least according to polling. And yet, we're also at this point where in the civilian world, just because of the popularity of things like large language models and how suited they are for very rapid answers or solutions to sophisticated problems, this new phenomenon, just a couple of years old, it's really convincing a lot of people to put a lot more faith in large language models to solve questions that before we would never think of giving to AI. How do you see that going? How do you see operators, particularly as part of the NCO Corps, pushing against the boundaries of skepticism? How do you convince them to go into this relationship, training an AI system that's going to be part of their team? And are you worried at all about that sort of automation bias that has taken over, like I feel like a lot of people that are playing around with ChatGPT or OpenAI or large language models right now? How do you help people to retain a certain amount of skepticism when now we have engines that can output seemingly correct solutions to all sorts of problems?
Yeah, so I would say it talks to workforce as well, because roles and responsibilities change. The need for how you interact with a lot of these AI tools, it's going to evolve over time, because AI is not this thing that's static. It continues to evolve itself and it continues to change. There's a lack of understanding and misconceptions about what AI is and what AI isn't. And the larger population just don't have the time, to spend educating themselves on, they're not going to become experts, okay, in AI. But I think it's important to note that it's just a set of tools and techniques that brings intelligent behavior to software systems. And it does encompass a broad range of technologies with even a broader range of applications there. So AI is not going to replace the human. I think humans that really take the time and work with a lot of these different tools, understand their capabilities, understand their limitations, understand, when to use them and when not to use them, are who's going to, come on top. Okay, so it's not, people often think, oh my goodness, AI is just going to completely displace jobs. AI is going to replace me. And that's not the case. But I think it was said, and I'm not the person who said it, I may have read that somewhere. So attributions to whomever it's due to, that it's not AI replacing humans. You've probably heard that, and it must have been a professor from Harvard, I think. But it's the humans, who really take their time to understand how to use AI and equip themselves with the right tools that are probably going to be most prominent in the workplace. So there's a lot of opportunities that we've seen with the advancements in AI to utilize the tools across different sectors to innovate. But with that comes risks as well. And part of assessing risks is understanding where the limitations are. And while ChatGPT it's certainly a lot of breakthrough there, in large part because the compute resources is there to support all of these, larger language models, processing and computation of these larger language models. The fact of the matter is, these models do have emergent behaviors that we still don't understand. And we have to understand that as a general public. These models they hallucinate. Everything that they're telling you is not gospel. And so it's more using AI and being comfortable with using a lot of these AI tools more so as an assistant to support you to brainstorm ideas, as opposed to saying that the tool said so, so it shall be so. Okay. And that's the danger, I think, when we're talking about adoption of a lot of those technologies. And I think you said it earlier, the department was an early developer. It was an early adopter of a lot of AI. For 6 decades, we've invested in that area. So a lot of the breakthroughs that you're seeing there in the public sector has been in large part due to the departments of defense being, sustaining investments over time. And we recognize the risks, we understand the risks, and I would say that we're taking all of the necessary measures to ensure responsible use and deployment of a lot of the AI-powered systems. We're educating our workforce, where there's across all of the services. There are senior leader courses that are in place. There's AI talent management pipelines that we continue to refine across the department. Understanding the roles, of engagement with different AI tools and systems are going to change over time, okay? There are the developers and there are the users. There are the leaders who need to be aware of where the limitations are so they don't get sucked in by the hype, because there are a lot of hype as well. There's goodness, but there's a lot of hype as well.
There is a lot of hype, which is always good for us journalists, but not necessarily good for everybody else. But I want to turn back really quickly to something that you mentioned a moment ago, and that is this question of human machine teaming and how to understand that risk reward trade-off, particularly in the context of military operations, because if we're talking about me using some small AI program to make a determination about whether or not to show you a certain ad on Instagram, that's very low risk. When we're talking about military operations, the risk goes exponentially higher, particularly in the context of urban warfare. Are you thinking at all, especially looking at what's going on right now in Gaza, but also looking at what's been going on in Ukraine, just as an observer? When you think about applications of artificial intelligence in an urban warfare context, where do you see as the opportunity space, and what do you see as potentially the biggest challenge? What can it help everybody do better in order to make these operations safer for civilians and for operators, and where is their risk?
Yeah, so you said it right. When we're talking about AI for defense applications, the risk, the consequences are much higher. Urban warfare is hard. Okay, it's like running a drone through a maze, quite frankly. And being able to ensure that we're enhancing situational awareness is one of the main reasons why we even employ use of a lot of these AI-enabled systems. Again, it's beyond line of sight essay of the scene of interest, for instance. So there's a lot of opportunities to continue to use those systems to really gain a broader understanding of that battlefield operation in that situation, right? But when you talk about the risk there, is when we're talking about even closing kill chains simply based on assessments that an AI system has done. And that's where, again, we have to be able to design and build in uncertainty estimations in a lot of these models, taking into consideration the downstream decision maker, who oftentimes is the human, okay? And so for us, when we're talking about areas when we're going to use AI or not use AI, we really start off with concept of operations. Okay, if it's an urban area, how we're going to employ those systems, understanding the inherent risk and challenges with employing those systems in this particular area, geographic area or environment writ large. We are working to integrate all of these different risk models and think about how when we're deploying models to different platforms based on mission and need, these risk models have to be integrated, okay? And then when I say risk, there's risk in mission, there's risk in potentially deploying capabilities fairly quickly that may not be fully vetted, and we need to assess that risk to the broader public. Our stance is always to minimize collateral damage. So whenever, however, we're employing a lot of these tools, whether it's AI-enabled autonomy or just, uncrewed systems writ large, regardless of the level of smarts that's in there, that risk calculus is something that's front and center to every conversation that we're having. Yeah. And as I mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, and I will say, as I mentioned with Kate, we've really strived to think through how we enhance those operations for use of AI. And we do note the hesitance in trusting AI despite being very comfortable currently accepting risk, because operators and commanders are people too. And even when you take AI out of the equation, regardless of the environment, the warfighter has historically been comfortable and successful accepting risk for military operations. So risk is not new to us. It's, again, making sure that when we're deploying these things, we're appropriately integrating those risk models as part of that package that's being deployed.
So I think that's fantastic. And it reminds me of something that I think the general public doesn't really appreciate, but that I kind of got a sense of I talk to the special operations community a lot. And I also sometimes talk to folks in law enforcement. I talk to a lot of folks that are trying to reform law enforcement around public safety. And one of the things that they bring up, actually across those two communities that I think is so interesting, is that the addition of artificial intelligence in some of these environments can actually serve to decrease the tension. Your force protection principles, the need to protect a human being from a situation where they don't control everything, can be decreased if you're using AI in the right way. Putting, for instance, a robot where a person would be, then you've changed the degree to which you have to be really assertive in protecting a person, because a person's not a blue force entity, an operator, a soldier, or a policeman is not physically there. And that gives you potentially a little bit more room to work with, so you don't have to go to the same tactics that you would if you had to stick human beings in an environment where something really bad might happen, engaging with an entity that they don't know the degree of threat that's there. So I wonder, as part of the cake experimentation, has any of that come out, that AI in certain situations could actually, and I don't want to presume, but actually decrease collateral damage, civilian casualties, or unwanted harm? Is that something you're beginning to see, or do you think you might begin to see?
So that's been the reason for adopting use of a lot of these AI autonomous systems across the DoD. Where can we, instead of putting our human operators in harm's way, employ a lot of these platforms to conduct very dull, dirty, and more dangerous tasks, right? But also understanding, again, the risk management component needs to be taken into consideration into the calculus. So as we're looking at the areas where we want to deploy those, and you're spot on, there's a lot of use of those tools that really gives us the ability to make decisions faster and really safeguard our human operators writ large. But I think, again, any effort to help the public understand the role humans, ethics, and overall trust apply to the use of AI is good. While we've taken steps to doing that under Kate, NIST is also at the forefront, as you know, developing their AI risk management framework, which helps to define some of the standards and best practices for how and when we're going to use a lot of these AI-based systems. But I'll say you captured it really well, spot on, Patrick. When we're talking about where we're going to use those systems, it's making sure that we're using them in areas that's going to give us truly an asymmetric advantage and get us to the point where we can save our warfighters' life. We're defense. So it's defending the nations and protecting our people comes first.
Yeah, and by making life safer for warfighters, that potentially makes life safer for all of the civilians around them. Right.
Absolutely.
So one of the other big areas that people have brought to me as a case where autonomy could play a huge decisive advantage is in EW contested environments, places where there's electromagnetic warfare, there's a contested spectrum. And what strikes me as really important about this is that when we talk about consumer applications of AI, we talk about, for instance, self-driving cars. These things do not operate in a contested environment. They're in constant contact with massive enterprise cloud server functions. They're constantly pulling, from massive libraries of data in real time to negotiate the world around them. When we talk about what life might be like in a combat setting against a very technologically competent peer adversary, there's not going to be opportunities for the platform, be it a drone or something else, to reach back to a massive enterprise cloud environment, and or for that matter to even reach back to a headquarters component, there's going to have to be autonomous decision making on board, and there might also be room for very small communications in little opportunities as we get better at electromagnetic warfare, finding holes in that contested environment to send small messages. So in terms of distributed autonomy of UAVs, lots and lots of cheap, small, but potentially very effective drones, which is what the Defense Department's talking about now, modeled largely after Ukraine and other things, particularly in these electromagnetic warfare contested environments. What do you feel is realistically achievable in the next 5 years and the next 10?
Great question. So I'll tell you first off, we're really driving towards more of that distributed collaborative autonomy. We've put a lot of emphasis, just like you've hit the nail on the head, for focusing on use of those systems at the tactical edge environment. You know, having the ability to sense, make sense of that information, do inference, do all of that computation at the edge. Having the ability to move data to, from, in between platforms. When we are in a contested environment, these platforms need to still be able to perceive their local, I would say UAV or even UXV writ large environment. Okay, so there has to be that mission resiliency that's built in. And oh, by the way, we're going to lose some and some are going to be added to the group. How do we continue to do that as we lose some and some are added to the group? So these are all problems that we're tackling, you know, working very closely across the services and with industry. And I think it's reasonable within, you know, the next 5 years, really, to evolve from single assets performing a mission, specific task, to a group of assets, you know, designed for planned missions that have an understanding of capabilities of limitations of every component of that team, whether it's another machine or it's a human operator that's part of that collaborative team. I also think that certain sets of missions is going to include human machines. Army, as you know, have already taken the steps to think about what force structure, force design needs to look like over the next few years. What does human-machine integrated formation truly look like? DARPA has had several programs, so has all of the services, Longbow concept from DARPA, for instance, focusing on teaming of those types of heterogeneous systems. But of course, I think while these capabilities are being developed today, they're being fielded, we're learning. We're just, again, at PC Capstone 4, doing collaborative autonomy within the context of ISR missions, doing active learning, and starting to think through and build in mission resiliency in those systems. But there's still a lot of work, I would say, that needs to be done. And we're going to, over the course of the next 10 years, continue to pursue R&D in more general collaborative autonomy of heterogeneous systems. And it may be well outside of the 5 to 10 years window, okay? Because there's a lot of complex interactions there that we have to be mindful of. While there are things that we can take, whether it's been developed in the commercial space and we could adopt and adapt to military applications, there's still some work that needs to be done to ensure that we have systems that are truly capable at a tactical edge in that highly contested environment, operate when connectivity between, you know, the control segments and those platforms are lost, right? And one of the things I'll tell you that we're starting to push towards is thinking through what distributed command and control look like in those environments. Because when we're in a contested environment, having one warfighter who's controlling all of those different systems, right, where there's a centralized comms link between system and operator, one, we're introducing a single point of failure. And it's not going to hold. The operator is going to be significantly burdened. And that's not going to be achievable in a degraded or contested environment.
Mm.
So really bringing on board not just the autonomy folks, the AI folks that are developing some of the advancements, but looking at the entire stack to include thinking about the networking environment across the joint, okay, are some of the things that we're doing. That's why I said earlier, it's not just a software conversation anymore.
Right. And is that part of the discussion around Replicator right now? Because I'm following Replicator, a lot of folks are, and we understand that there's a lot of attention at it in terms of the question of like, can we scale up to this hardware challenge, right? Like, are we capable of making lots and lots of cheap drones very, very quickly that will have some autonomy? But you're talking about something else. You're talking about a level of coordination and actual in-moment thinking and reasoning that we haven't seen anywhere else. I think a lot of folks think of collaborative autonomous behavior, and they think of those pre-programmed kind of ballets that drones do at like football games or sporting events, as though that's something that you just program in and then they just go do it. They're not thinking about doing it. You're talking about actual coordinated in the air thinking from these different assets as they perceive the threats and opportunities around them as kind of like within a mesh network. Is that part of the replicator discussion? And where are we on that? Where do you see, what's most exciting to you about that replicator program?
So what I will say about that, Patrick, is we have an excellent group of people led by DIU that are forging forward with shaping all things replicator, making phenomenal progress. Any responses, though, as it pertains to replicator, I would have to defer to the DSD's office. I know we're in the process of developing guidance that's going to be published on just what we can share, or news media and replicator, but not something that I can discuss today. Sorry.
It's okay. But that's okay.
But I will tell you, you're spot on. What I will address is what you've brought up in terms of the coordination, right? Where you talked about 5 and you talked about 10. And remember, I said we've got to also be thinking beyond that, understanding where the challenges are. We're not going to wait until we have this wonderful collaborative, wonderful coordination to start moving out, scaling and deploying things. But that's where we want to go. We want to be able to have that, distributed network, autonomous network even of these autonomous systems that can perceive their local environment and really operate resiliently in those types of contested environments. And to do that, it comes down to less of the centralized command and control of those assets, and really pushing towards distributed command and control of those assets. Okay, I would say even hierarchical command and control of those assets to get to the point where we could do C2 on demand.
So,
and we're R&E. I sit in R&E, as you know. We have to be forward thinking. Go ahead.
So the hard part then is, does that now exist anywhere else? Like, do you have to create that from scratch, or is there a use case that maybe comes out of autonomous vehicles in Silicon Valley, or maybe even out of China, or someplace else where there's a blueprint for how to create autonomous collaboration on platform without reaching back to massive enterprise clouds? Or is this something now it is your job to kind of create for the first time in this universe?
So there's elements of this that exist. I mean, when you think of what that stack looks like, there's your network and comms. We have, universal command and control suites that we've put in place. We being, R&E, research and engineering branch of OSD. We're leveraging work that the Navy has done for other applications that can be leveraged here to really build out what this distributed multi-agent framework needs to look like to support this. Army has done a lot of work, so has the Air Force in their crewed, uncrewed team information. I mentioned DARPA's longbow concept. DARPA is also very forward thinking there. So there's elements across the department that are building blocks. We just got to bring it all together and address the challenges at the seams when doing so. We've put in place an IPT, an integrated product team, that brings all of the services working together on really shaping and developing what such an autonomous stack for distributed command and control could look like. Again, taking all of these building blocks that we've invested in over the years and starting to bring it all together, understanding that we're not going to wait for a 100% solution.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, Kim, thank you so much for talking with us today and sharing your insights. I think it's fantastic to learn about what the next few years actually looks like and the challenges they're in and how rapidly we're overcoming many of those challenges, but also how much work it is in order to do that and work not just from the folks that are doing the math, but really everybody that touches the military has some interest in helping to build those relationships between people and the tools that they'll use to achieve advantage. So thank you so much for helping us to understand all of that a little bit better. Up next, I will continue today's discussion with Amelia Probasco from Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where we'll talk about this sort of broader environment of AI development, some of the competition aspects between the United States, China, and Russia, where the Defense Department is really nailing it on deploying and experimenting with AI. Some areas of improvement, particularly in terms of acquisition. So stick around, and we'll see you in a minute. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimberly Sablon.
Thank you, Patrick. This was fun.
Good. Welcome back, everyone. I am pleased to continue today's discussion and welcome Amelia Probasco, a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, to talk a little bit about the future of the U.S. military's adoption and experimentation with artificial intelligence, and really just this AI moment that we're all having, what it means for the U.S. national security environment, and how we can all think about it a little bit more productively and realistically without losing this great kind of ethos of enthusiasm that's taken hold of the public discussion. So Amelia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So yes, AI is having this big moment in the public mind and to a large extent in the Defense Department as well, with the stand-up of the relatively new CDAO office. But one of the things that you cover at Georgetown is some of the disconnect between some of the hype that might exist in the public consciousness and the military's efforts to work AI into experimentation and even operation, which actually goes back several decades. What is the military doing right now with AI that's a little bit different through exercises like Scarlet Dragon and others that you may have seen?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for pointing out that some of this is not that new. The military's been using versions of AI or autonomy for a long time. But yeah, the technology has come a long way. The hype isn't totally unfounded in the sense that things are starting to work and it's very exciting times. The realistic sorts of applications that I've seen, the ones that are really exciting, are where we're getting operators experimenting and using these tools and working side by side with engineers to develop applications. And Scarlet Dragon's a fantastic example because you have this rapid iteration between warfighters and operators and then developers trying to look at how you can use software or just workflow, but then also AI to identify and then do artillery fire, which used to be, I mean, I don't think everybody realizes how hard and slow and just turning around with a sheet of paper kinds of workflows used to exist, to something that's way more automated, something you would recognize a little more easily, and one that's a little more reliable because it's a computer that's transiting and as opposed to people writing things down. And that's had great effects, but that's really different from the computer recognizes all of a sudden that there's a target out there, makes a decision to do something about it, and it goes autonomously. That is not happening. We're seeing much more responsible applications. and but also a lot of experimentations to see what could come next.
Right. So you mentioned the collapse in the time between target identification and action on target, and I remember just observing Project Convergence during the first year when they let reporters go out and sit in the tent and see how it was all going to go, and they were using some AI. Program called Firestorm at the time to do exactly that, to basically streamline the process of finding the appropriate platform in the air, on the ground, whatever it was, that could take action against a target, the target being known to all the humans, not necessarily found by an AI entity. And while not all of the shots actually made it to target, which was a fundamental problem with the Urca cannon and a couple of other things, they did succeed in collapsing that process from what used to be a thing that could take days with PDFs exchanging hands to something more like minutes. So do you think that's Project Convergence, that's the Army, and they're very upfront in talking about some of this experimentation as opposed to other services. Is that that acceleration through really very known AI tools, is that something that's happening across the services? Are you also seeing that to a certain extent in Navy exercises, in the Air Force?
Yeah, I mean, so the Army problem, especially in an artillery fire, is a very different situation than what the Navy problem might be in the way that the Navy tends to operate. And it's also different from the Air Force. I think everyone's experimenting and trying different things, and it's kind of a race for the best idea to succeed right now. The Navy's experimentation, they've done a lot with the autonomous surface vehicles or just different autonomous vehicles. So that's where their focus seems to be a little bit more. And I just had a great visit out to the San Diego USVs to kind of see how they're experimenting, and they're trying lots of different things to try and do command and control and generate new concepts of operations. And then, of course, I hear a lot about, though I'm less familiar with CCA, Combat Collaborative Aircraft for the Air Force, and sort of autonomy that's built in there. But I think for each service, they have different missions, and they're trying to experiment with AI that will, in a way that will best further their mission. What we can see next, and what I think you also see a little bit with General Kurilla coming out of the 18th Airborne Scarlet Dragon, is that now they're sort of at the operational level or at the COCOM level and experimentation to see, hey, how can we use decision support systems to get a better sense, situational awareness of the battlefield. I mean, even, to your example where you're saying, hey, they were matching the platform that was going to be the shooter to the target. It's actually really difficult to know, where are your assets? How many weapons do they have? How much more fuel do they have left? That's a super hard problem. So I don't know that we're fully there yet, but it's certainly what a commander wants to know. And it seems possible to get more information than we've ever had before with these systems. A lot of people are trying to get that.
Yeah. So going back to that, because you mentioned Kurilla, who I've talked with, and he's certainly one of the folks that since his time at Fort Liberty has been really out front and leading some of this stuff. But you have different services, all have different needs for AI. You have an artillery problem on the Army side. We just talked with Fifth Fleet not too long ago. They're deploying these autonomous vessels for things like just creating observability in the sea right now around Haiti, so that they can interdict human smuggling off of Haiti with autonomous vessels, which is kind of, I thought, an interesting use case that I hadn't heard about. And there's a lot of hope that a large number of autonomous vessels may play a role in a sort of that deterrence mission in the Indo-PACOM. To your mind, just very briefly, do you see these very distinct mission sets converging in a way that is coherent or makes sense at the COCOM level?
Well, I mean, I think, to be fair, they always have to converge at the COCOM level and be coherent to what the COCOM is trying to achieve. The question is, how far up the chain can you really develop these systems that can give you global situational awareness and the ability to make decisions? And I think there's a really interesting question that we may face here, where all of this autonomy, the way we've worked, there's this great quote that my old boss used to use, that it used to be fun to go to sea, and then they gave us radios. So you'd have in the Navy, all these commanders out there operating with delegated authority, doing what they know how to do. And that was incredibly powerful. And in fact, we've even seen in some Chinese writing that like they really respect our ability to delegate and get things done, that's very powerful for us. But when you put AI into the equation, you actually could potentially face a choice to either continue down this road of delegated authority, everybody's got this and they're able to make their independent decisions, or hoovering up all the decisions up to a higher level and kind of trying to play a war game at that kind of COCOM. As we face that decision, I think that's going to be really interesting because there's an optimum somewhere in the middle there. But certainly every COCOM at least wants to know what's going on and then be able to strategically guide any kind of operational effort.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and fascinating point. If you, for viewers out there, of course, if you've been watching what's been going on in Ukraine, you know that one of the great things that we've helped Ukraine to do that's been so effective on the battlefield is just develop that NCO core, really distribute authority down to a much smaller level, which allows for much faster decision making in the field, and that's what lets them be really nimble. That's what lets them take a shot and maneuver really quickly and really hand it to their adversary. And there might be some friction between an AI decision engine that has a view of the battlefield in terms of ingested data versus what a sergeant major is perceiving at that moment, and that's an interesting friction that you really have two potential tools there that are going to operate very differently. And just knowing the culture of the U.S. military, we're not going to let go of the NCO core expertise without an argument. But I want to go back to something that you said a moment ago, because you talked about China. To the extent that you can, how is the U.S. military thinking about AI that's fundamentally different from China and Russia? I think the U.S., of course, has this, as we know, this very long list of AI ethics principles that govern military AI use and adoption. And if you're worried that they don't go far enough, it's not coincidental that so many other nations that we're allies with are now adopting the U.S. military AI ethics principles as kind of a framework for how they think about this. It's much longer than anything I've ever seen out of Silicon Valley in terms of an ethical framework for AI. And I think some people have this perception that China and Russia are willing to take a lot more risk, especially in terms of lethal autonomy. Is that the right way to think about it, or how do we really talk about their mindset in terms of AI for the military?
And I think I would start with the similarities as opposed to the differences. They want to use AI to do the dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs as much as we do. And they also want to shorten, as they say, the OODA loop, just like we want to shorten the OODA loop. We want to be able to make better decisions faster. So you can see there are advertisements of Chinese decision support systems that if you just look at the UI picture of the screen, it looks pretty similar to the sorts of things you'd see from marketing in the US. We all want that. Any warfighter wants situational awareness and the ability to make better decisions faster, fine. Now, where the ethics piece come, I originally wanted to do a more direct comparison of sort of what we'd seen come out in terms of the Chinese ethical principles and the US ethical principles. And I look mostly actually at the national level, vice at the military level, but there's a healthy level of interplay between the two. And what you find is that China is, in the documents that you read, using some of the same words for ethical principles that we are using. So for example, in the DepSecDef's memo, we have the word governable. So you want AI systems to be governable, the ability to just actually control them and tell them what to do and turn them off if they do the wrong thing. China's got controllable. It's the same concept. They use controllable, we use governable, but generally you can map those two together. So some of them seem straightforward. Other ones are a lot harder. So it turns out in Chinese, the word in the US, we have safety and we have security, and they're two very different, very important concepts. And you have different teams that evaluate safety versus security. In China, it's the same word for safety and security. So when I wanted to go look up how are the Chinese looking at these different principles of ethical AI or responsible AI, you immediately run into a language problem in that you need a pretty sophisticated translator to tell you when the word they're using is in the context of safety or in the context of security. There's also the issue of even if you were to read all of the Chinese governance documents that talk about their AI ethical principles, you run into a little bit of a problem where just because they wrote it down does not mean that's what they are actually doing. So how to actually know what's happening versus what they've written down is a whole field of study. So I don't think you can assume that they don't care. They want these things to work. They are also accountable. They don't want to mess up or screw up in any way, shape, or form, AI or no. But we just don't know exactly how and where they are more willing to cut corners or where they might have different ROE than we do. And I think that is the sort of reason why you see the DoD really pushing forward on AI ethical principles. They've been super public about with the DepSecDev memo. They published the CDO published the RAI ethical toolkit. There's a ton of info coming out of the DoD trying to instantiate global norms and set the tone and hope that not just our allies, but China starts to agree to some of them.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and it really, in so many ways, all of that speaks to other big fundamental value distinctions between these two places. The U.S. military fights by, with, and through allies now, and getting Europeans on board and getting Silicon Valley and private investors on board is really essential to a lot of their plans for how to do anything, and that involves, being out front on things like ethical principles. It's just sort of the way you keep your allies, the populations of France and Germany, invested in a continued partnership with you. It's actually a really important point. There is this sense, though, and you certainly get it from military leaders that go and testify on Capitol Hill. You get it to a certain extent from lawmakers too, that there's a competition in artificial intelligence between the U.S. and China. China, of course, having huge access to lots and lots of data. And the U.S. military having, a lot of data that is its own, not all of it structured in a way that's going to be available to really forward-looking or relevant AI models for the battlefield. But that data distinction is something that a lot of folks are very worried about. But a lot of that data that China has is actually on Chinese citizens. So I wonder, in terms of the battlefield, do you feel like China may have, what are the strengths and weaknesses of either party? Let's put it that way. We're very good at joint exercising across the domains. We have a joint force that operates really well. We're really good at empowering NCOs. And we're really good at buying things from defense contractors. But we still have some cleaning to do in terms of how we organize the military around this AI moment. Does China have certain advantages in this competition? And is competition even really the right way to think about it? I think it comes out of kind of a Cold War paradigm, but is it really applicable to this new set of relations?
It's such an interesting, multifaceted question. So let me try and let me start with the competition. Yes, I do think there is a competition, and I think it's economic. I think it's security. I think it's pure research. I do think there's a competition. Now, the dimensions of it, one, you started with data, which really I think is super interesting because people are like, oh my gosh, China's got all this data. But do they have data that's useful? Is it the right kind of data to fight a war? They, as you point out, they have a ton of data on faces. And they also are able to take data from their ecosystem in a way that we do not here. But is that data going to be useful in a fight? One of the things that my colleague Sam Bresnick's been reading a lot of senior leaders in Chinese. He's been reading senior leader thought leadership papers in Chinese. And one of the things that they will point out is that the United States has this incredible experience. We've basically been at war for so long that we have a lot of data that they simply do not have. They have exercises and ideas. We have real world data. And we can use that in a way that they cannot. So I think, we have to ask ourselves, well, what sort of data are we talking about? And is it really useful? Is it fit for purpose? Because it's not like any data whatsoever. I mean, there's a great example of Google's incredibly good at recognizing the face of a cat. That doesn't do me a ton of good in finding a time critical target. So it's realizing what sort of data is really going to help you in your use case. The other point about data, again, going back to some of the work Sam's done, is that we have this, the US often will complain like, oh, our data, it's all stovepipe, it's all over the place, we don't have it structured, we don't have the metadata. Turns out the Chinese write all the same comments about their own data, except it may be even worse because they're still writing some of it on paper. So great that you've got certain kinds of data, but if you can't harness it in any meaningful way, then it's just sort of an academic exercise. And then the last thing that you said that I really want to pick up on, you said, oh, the US is really good at buying things from defense contractors. Like, I think some defense contractors might disagree with us on that particular point, because I think we still have room to grow and getting better at buying software. And so much of this is software based. And I think it requires an approach that doesn't lend itself well to what we've done in the past, per se.
Yeah, no, that is a very important point. We continue to the Defense Department continues to make these workarounds for how bad it is at acquiring information technology through the establishment of DIU and other things like that. And what these entities represent is a fundamental imbalance between how good the Defense Department was at buying tanks and boats and ships during the Cold War versus how bad it is right now at acquiring digital-based solutions and open platforms and all the things that are going to be relevant to the next century. I guess I meant good in terms of able to write checks, but I want to go back to something that you said a moment ago too, because you talked about one of the things that's sort of very exciting is the way the Defense Department is trying to build these relationships between operators and unmanned systems, and I think at a certain level, yes, absolutely, the Defense Department leaders are very interested in making sure that human-machine teaming actually meets the promise. A lot of polling suggests that operators of actual operators, there's a lot of skepticism between them and the systems that they are training, which is good, probably very healthy. You have to work with the system so that it reflects you in the way that you think. It understands sort of who you are. And so overcoming that skepticism is part of the reason you do human-machine teaming. But how do you see that relationship going, where operators perhaps at a very low level and then maybe at a command level are developing different relationships with either autonomy in the form of robotics or maybe AI assistance or other things? Is that relationship building moving in a way that is going to enable that human-machine vision to become reality?
Yeah, so I think this is the big issue now, is that the tech's actually starting to work, and now we have to figure out how to get the people to work with the tech. There's an article that was in Bloomberg not too long ago that focused on Scarlet Dragon, and in it there's this great quote from an NCO that's like, this stuff don't work. And that was sort of the beginning of this NCO's experience with the system that Scarlet Dragon was using. But then even over the course of the article, you see that person start to track over and say, actually, this stuff works really well. And I'm really happy because it's really made my operations much more efficient. So I think we're going to see a lot of evolution as people get more familiar and start experimenting with these technologies more. That said, I think there's the folks who approach this and say, hey, that stuff doesn't work, and I'm completely furious with the hype because I thought it was going to make me breakfast in addition to everything else. There's another side that we sometimes overlook, which is this phenomenon called automation bias, if you're familiar with it. And the best way to explain automation bias is to Google people who follow GPS into the water. There's a bunch of examples of unfortunate people who followed GPS and literally drove into the water in Hawaii. And so we do end up forming relationships with our technology that can sometimes veer from, hey, I don't trust this thing at all, to, oh, I actually probably trust this thing too much. I would do what this thing says, even when my instincts tell me that I'm about to go drive off a bridge. That calibrating between, I absolutely don't trust this thing at all when I probably should, and I trust this thing way too much when I probably shouldn't, is a big problem to begin with. And I think it gets even worse when you're interacting with a system that corresponds like a human, right? It is using natural language, and so it becomes even harder to start to figure out, should I trust this the way that I trust a human? Do I have a mental model of this as a person? Or do I have a mental model of this as a statistics machine that's sort of putting something out? How do I trust it appropriately? All of these issues, I think, are kind of the next big thing for really operationalizing AI. If the tech works, that's great. But if a warfighter won't use it or can't use it appropriately, then we have a whole new set of issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that sort of speaks to why AI is having this moment. It is the arrival of huge public-facing large language models that folks are now able to use to, in the place of, in some cases, a lawyer or an accountant, or to devise marketing and business strategies, and use in a whole other contexts where, the costs of failure are relatively constrained as opposed to the U.S. military. So we know that the Defense Department, specifically the Office of the Secretary, has launched this task force Lima, to look at the risks and rewards of large language models and generative AI in the hands of warfighters. But to your point, how do we? Well, I guess this is exactly the conversation that we're having. How do we avoid falling into a trap of trusting an advice engine that's right 90% of the time? Because that threshold might be okay if you're deciding whether or not to show a particular iPhone user an ad, but that failure threshold is very high if you're talking about urban warfare. Do you, just based on what you see now, do you think that it's a high? Does that mean that the U.S. military is going to move to a higher risk tolerance, or will they have to forego using some of these large language models that the rest of the world is using with what feels like really great success?
I don't think it's going to change our risk tolerance. I don't think it should change our risk tolerance. I think we will experiment and learn what we can reasonably do with these systems in safe situations. And then as we get more familiar, as our literacy improves and we get a better sense of its technical limitations, then we can deploy it in higher risk situations. But it's like any advanced technical system at that point. I grew up on Aegis. Aegis has capes and limbs. All you need to know are what are the capabilities and what are the limitations, and that's how I will use or deploy the system. And I have doctrine that I follow and ConOps and battle orders. There's a huge governance mechanism that has nothing to do with the technology. It has everything to do with the bureaucracy, which is, I know, sometimes a bad word, but it is actually what will allow us to reasonably deploy some of these things in the right situation. There's been, if you go into ChatGPT now and you go look at their various GPTs, I haven't done this in maybe a month or so, but I started to search through to find any military ones I could find. And lo and behold, there is a GPT tuned for almost every service that has to do with your annual evaluation, which is, of course, like the perfect thing to build, because nobody likes to write those things. Also awards. There's also several out there for like writing your award nomination. That, they aren't works of art. They're things that you have to do. And so it makes a ton of sense that we would start experimenting. Now, there might be some security concerns there. So I don't know that that's official TOD policy to put all your achievements into GPT. But nonetheless, like that kind of an application and use case makes a ton of sense. That is very different than entering in like, hey, I'm on a battlefield and I have the following sorts of things. Can you please generate 3 COAs? And when the course of action recommendation comes back, it's like, oh, you have an 83% chance of success. Like that is false. Yeah. There's no 83% chance of success. And we just need to figure out where the reasonable applications are and where the unreasonable ones are.
Yeah, well, that brings me to, I think, a really important point. A lot of these public-facing LLMs that have so ignited public imagination, and they really do in many ways represent the best in class because they have such a huge user pool, which means they have such a huge data pool. They are also public-facing all over the world. There's a lot of reports of Russian and Chinese military and also government folks and certainly researchers using OpenAI's large language models for different purposes than we would use them here. And this is part of the nature of dealing with technology, that has its roots in consumer tech, and the military wants to do more business with consumer technology companies because they don't have to be the only customer. But with that comes a certain amount of usage risk. So when you look at some of these companies, are you nervous at all, or I'm not sure how you put it, apprehensive about the degree to which we're talking about them just as a population, as a country, our enthusiasm for them, and perhaps we're unaware of how open they are even to potential adversaries?
Yeah, this is a complex question. Let me start with saying I'm pretty excited and enthused about the way that the commercial sector in the United States has gotten engaged on national security issues and want to make a meaningful difference. So we looked, especially with the invasion of Ukraine, at the way big tech companies in particular responded to that invasion. And they did things that I think all of us should be very proud of. Microsoft did an incredible amount of work and dedicated a lot of money to defending networks. Now, in their words, it was to defend the integrity of their product, but the end effect was that it was helpful in defending Ukraine. Starlink obviously had a really big impact for the operations in Ukraine. Google did things, Apple did things. Smaller companies like Primer and Clearview AI both did things to try and support and help Ukraine in its defense against the Russian invasion. So I think we should all be pretty proud and give those guys a high five for doing some of those things without contracts. They went at risk. If you read their SEC reports, they'll even put in there, hey, we did this thing to defend Ukraine and we may now be targets of Russia. And in fact, Russians later come out and say, satellites are a legitimate military target. So I think that's all to the good. I do take the point, though, that when you start to rely on commercial technology in a national security instance, there's sort of two issues that people talk about a lot. One is the security risk. So in a commercial company, you might take a different approach to your cybersecurity in particular, which is not acceptable on the government side. And so I think there's been some relatively recent examples where the government adopted commercial technology and there was some cybersecurity flaw in there that, on the commercial side wasn't a big deal, but in the DoD was a pretty big deal. The other issue is that business plans change. So if you want to establish a relationship with a commercial vendor, it's going great, but then all of a sudden the commercial vendor realizes that their business strategy takes them more into consumer facing or a consumer kind of a customer as opposed to the Defense Department as a customer, and they abandon the product or the business, it goes out of business. Then the DoD is in a tough spot. So those are the two criticisms that I will often hear. But in general, I think it's pretty exciting because these are the best developers in the world who want to get engaged on national security problems.
Yeah, I think that, obviously it's so essential that we bring these, the best of American tech talent into the common mission of working on behalf of American values and the safety of American people. It does become tricky as you deal more with Silicon Valley and you deal with, companies that have to make money no matter what, and sometimes personalities that are a little bit chaotic. I think that Elon Musk is a great example. If you like Elon Musk or you don't like Elon Musk, you should wait 5 minutes and you'll change your mind, much like he will. But to your point, there's a lot that the Defense Department needs to continue to do to make sure that folks that are producing things that are relevant to how we're going to live in the 21st century continue to want to work with the Defense Department. And there's, in terms of speed of contracting, outreach, and transparency, there's a lot of things the Defense Department can do a little bit better, even though they've made a lot of improvements, is my sort of take on it. But Amelia, thank you so much for joining us today. That is all the time we have for this particular session. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. In case you missed any of today's conversation or wanted to share it with your friends and colleagues, it will be available on demand within 24 hours. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.